So the next section is mainly about like research and advice to students. We're gonna start by focusing on like condensed matter, which is your area of research, and then we're gonna talk about like some questions related to like general physics related questions. So if you can give us like an overview of like your main research interest at the moment or like projects, and how did they evolve over time since you came to OSU?
Okay. So, I'd say my main interest thematically has been pretty consistent, which is, using scanning tunneling microscopy to understand and control materials at the atomic scale. And I've always been interested in kind of how properties of atoms kind of evolve from, isolated atoms in gas phase that people study in atomic physics to atoms in solid materials, either the material itself or impurities in those materials. And so STM is kind of gives you an insight into an intermediate step in that evolution, because we can easily study single atoms and they're on a surface. So they're not the same as an atom in the bulk, but they're also not the same as an atom completely in vacuum. So over the years, we've kind of explored different aspects of that, maybe sometimes focusing on atoms themselves, like atoms on particular surfaces. Other times focusing on atomically thin materials, like two-dimensional materials. But in general, the theme is to kind of really understand how the atomic properties are influencing and being influenced by the material.
Right. And are there topics that you are like excited about, like to work on with like the next generation of graduate students, especially with the rise of like quantum information and artificial intelligence on two sides?
Yeah, so we've we've I wouldn't say that we're coming late to quantum information science, because we've in some sense been doing it for a while, but mainly with a very specific focus on looking at atoms that would be relevant as qubits in a solid. So a lot of the progress in quantum computing right now is being driven by superconducting qubits. That's what companies like Google have invested heavily in, and those are working better and better every year. But there's some interest in alternatives to alternative qubits, and so isolated atoms in a solid. Can we realize that vision of having an isolated atom, but in a solid environment, is kind of what we're pivoting a lot of our efforts to. And that meshes well with work we've done previously on looking at impurities in semiconductors. So we've done a lot of work on that, and now we can use that for materials that are more relevant for quantum information.
Looking forward to that. And so maybe to wrap this part about condensed matter, are there things that you wanted to know when you were a graduate student, or things that you think could have been helpful when you were a graduate student? This is like, if we can summarize this, basically like an advice to students interested in doing PhD in condensed matter experiment.
Um, well, again, I have to say, like, I think things were a lot simpler. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough that I have seen a little bit of evolution in the scientific enterprise. In general, I think students are at a pretty high level now. But one thing I strongly encourage is, and I do see that still in students. There's so much information now that is way more accessible than it ever has been in the past. So really filtering through that information in multiple ways and critically thinking about it is more important now than it ever has been. So I often tell my group, just because it's published doesn't mean it's right, and it takes a lot of time and critical thinking to kind of filter out papers that you want to really follow or take very seriously, and papers that maybe are not so important.
I see. This also covers actually two of the other questions we had here, which, like, how has the field of physics changed since you started your PhD? I think you did mention part of that. If you would like to elaborate more, feel free. and the other question was like, what specific skill do you think is most relevant for researcher in your field at the moment? And also, I did highlight that.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, one thing I would stress is kind of collaboration skills. So, part of the kind of filtering process and just kind of critical thinking, and I have to really nag my students about this, and they'll attest to that, is to like take notes, because things happen so fast nowadays that I think people often find that slowing down to take notes actually is like, they don't want to do that. They don't want to slow themselves down. But as far as like the really being thoughtful about what you're doing and then being able to communicate it to other people, it's really essential to take notes.
You mean like documenting your work progress?
Yeah, so like, lab notebooks is, when I started, I had a written lab notebook and took that really seriously. I still have some on my shelves there. And, it helps not only you, just like, for example, when you're writing your dissertation, you can go back, if you've taken good notes, you can go back and more quickly integrate, what you did perhaps 2 years ago. But it also really helps communicate with your advisor and with collaborators. So things are just much closer at hand. You can really dive into the important questions and not spend meeting time, figuring out where files are or things like that.
Is there a structure or like a way that you advise your student to do that, or like a specific organized way of doing it?
Yeah, so my group uses OneNote as electronic notebooks, which have some pros and cons. But the nice thing is that it's immediately shareable, and I've been kind of gradually refining a template for pages over time. Because a lot of times, like if we're taking scanning tunneling microscope images, we'll kind of keep a timeline of imaging as it comes in. And, the most important thing that I think people don't do habitually is kind of record their thoughts. And so, why, what are they seeing and how does that inform what they do next? So that's one skills I stress to everyone is documenting your thoughts, because when you go back 2 weeks later, you won't have any idea why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I do agree on that. And I think the next question is mainly is more general, but like, what is in your opinion, or like, who is a physics PhD in your opinion? Like, what are you looking at when you are training your students to become a physics PhD, or like, what is your expectation out of that?
Well, I take a broad view because I think people do have different strengths. And I think having a PhD doesn't mean that you're a strong researcher, but it can mean that. But you might be strong in some aspects and not in other aspects. I think as a foundation, though, the PhD does mean that you've made an original contribution to knowledge. So the stronger students kind of take more initiative in defining what that contribution is, and maybe take more ownership of like developing it further. But everyone that gets a PhD has contributed to new knowledge in some way.
So, do you think like is the fact that physics programs train the students to be like general problem solvers a good thing for our community, or like, because this is one aspect of also being a PhD student? And since like many physicists by training like leave physics research to pursue like more profitable avenue, do you also see this as a problem, or do you think part of what the physics PhD is about is actually training you to be a good problem solver and then explore whichever avenue you want?
Yeah, I definitely think that's super important. And in my group, I'd say about half the students have gone into academia, different routes in academia, and half have gone into industry. Only maybe one or two are doing kind of anything related to what they did as a PhD student. So the general problem solving skills are probably the most important thing to take away from your time here.
And so, as a final question from this part, what are the most important qualities in your opinion of a grad student? or like a grad student in your group, or how do you choose to admit a grad student in your group? And maybe you can reflect also on when you were a grad student, like what do you think were the most important qualities for you as a grad student?
Well, definitely working well with others is super important. So communicating with other people, taking initiative to learn from other people. So, the stronger students kind of naturally do that. They don't assume that they just want to figure everything out by themselves. Like, problem solving is not just like you do everything yourself. It's about not reinventing the wheel and learning from other people, because people are looking at problems in different ways, different angles. And you can solve a lot more problems by being able to adopt those different viewpoints. So that would be, definitely one important thing.
I see. I agree on that. And if we look on the other side of that, like what do you think a student should be looking for in an advisor?
Well, let's see. I mean, I think everyone does have different styles that they prefer for advisors. Like, the typical one that comes up is, do you want an advisor that's more hands-on or more hands-off? So, I tend to be a little bit hands-off, but, I meet with all my students weekly, and, I think keep pretty good tabs on what's going on, but it's important to me that they have some time to try to figure things out.
I see. Was there like when you mentioned like you choosing your advisor in Santa Barbara, was it mainly like the GRA position, or you also had like a specific criteria on choosing your advisor as a PhD student?
Yeah, so like I said before, I was definitely way less savvy than what I encourage students now to do. To be honest, at that time, my advisor wasn't really that central a figure. What really sold me on was actually the group and the group of other people that I was working with. So I really, he had assembled a really great group of people. There's a postdoc, Paul Kroll, that became a professor at University of Minnesota, and also a senior grad student that I was kind of shadowing when I started in the group. His name is Vladimir Nikitin, and he went on to a long career at Hitachi Magnetic Storage in the San Jose area. So, the advisor had kind of created this environment with, people like really working hard, like really engaged in what they're doing, trying new ideas, and that's what really sold me on sticking with the group.